Hi. I think we are live right now. My name is Berat, and we are with Graham Oppy, Professor Graham Oppy, who is at Monash University. Professor Oppy has made a lot of work in philosophy of religion, most notably arguing about gods, in which he criticizes some philosophical arguments for the existence of God, and describing gods, which was about several attributes of God, whether God is a coherent concept and so on. And latest, Naturalism and Religion, in which he defines religion and compares religion and naturalism with each other, their theoretical virtues, how they compare to each other, and so on. And best argument against God, I think this was before Naturalism and Religion, in which he develops the best case of best case for atheism, which is actually an argument for naturalism. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It's an argument for naturalism.
Welcome, Professor Oppy. And first, can you talk us with about your religious background and philosophical background, maybe?
Okay, sure. So my family is Christian, Methodist. So in a number of different branches of my family, going back quite a fair way, almost all of my family all of my great-grandparents came to Australia during the gold rush period, so the 1850s, and they all came from different parts of England, but they all turned out pretty much to have Methodist background. So my immediate family was Methodist. My parents were both religious believers. They met through church. My mother remained Methodist, a sort of strongly convinced religious believer until she died. My father, it's less clear. His faith kind of waned a bit in his later years, and he might have been something closer to an agnostic by the time that he died. So I grew up going to church, to Methodist church, Methodist Sunday school. Somewhere around the age of 12, 13, I just decided I didn't believe it. That was kind of the end as far as that was concerned. So that's my background in religion. My background in philosophy, I did 2 undergraduate degrees, one in science doing maths and physics, and one in the arts doing philosophy and history and philosophy of science. I then went on to do PhD in philosophy of language, and sometime after that, by a series of accidents, I ended up working in philosophy of religion. And it started with a book that I wrote about ontological arguments, and since then I've pretty much all of my philosophical career has been in philosophy of religion. Not quite all of it. I had a big project on the history of philosophy in Australia and New Zealand that issued in a number of books, but apart from that.
Which was interesting when I looked into your work, that your first work was in philosophy of language and aesthetics, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I published a few things in aesthetics early on as well.
How do you define? So we can start with basics, I guess. The definition of naturalism you developed in your book. How do you define naturalism? Because you have a broader definition of naturalism, as far as I understand, than most other writers, both critics of naturalism and defenders of naturalism.
So I probably should start by saying that if you want me to explain what naturalism is, it's probably better not to go for a definition. So, yeah. And I'll start with the kind of explanation of how I think about it, and then we can come back to the definition. And I have a kind of philosophical view that definition's not really that important or useful generally in philosophy. So start with a theistic picture. one that will be familiar to people in the Abrahamic religions. So things begin with God, and one of the things that God does is create, and you get a creation, and we live in part of that creation. And the ways that God relates to our part of the creation are twofold. There's some special actions that God does, those are miracles, and then there's a kind of general action that God does, which conserves in existence and maybe also kind of allows, permits stuff to happen, right? So God concurs with what happens. So you've got this picture of a domain that is made by God that we inhabit. The domain is governed by laws, natural laws, that God can occasionally interrupt with miracles. So people who look at this picture who don't believe in God are going to remove various things from it. They'll take away all the miracles, and they'll think that where theists see miraculous events, there were events that were not miraculous that happened. They'll keep the laws or some equivalent for it, and then they'll take away God, and they'll take away the other kinds of, general, the general support that God gives, the keeping it, maintaining it in existence and concurring with what happens. What you've got left when you subtracted those things is just natural reality. And most theists are happy with the idea that what scientists do is they investigate natural reality, they investigate the natural laws. So what naturalists say is that domain, so this is first approximation, that domain is what there is. That's all there is. So the reason why they get called naturalists is because they say that the only part of that bigger picture that they accept is the natural reality. And it's not problematic from the point of theists to understand this. They're committed to the idea that God made a natural reality and then was related to it in these ways. So that should be enough to kind of orient you towards what the distinction is here, what naturalism is, how naturalism is different from theism. If you're a philosopher, you're going to have some questions. And one of the big questions is going to be about whether there's yet another domain, a domain of abstract objects that you need for various reasons. Lots of people who want to claim themselves to be naturalists have also thought that we should try to get rid entirely of the domain of abstract objects as well. But there are famous philosophers, so perhaps the most famous Anglo-American philosopher of the 20th century who was a naturalist was Quine. And Quine was a Platonist. He thought that there are sets. He thought that there are abstract objects. And so it's pretty standard for people to think that naturalists can go either way on the question about abstract objects. They might say that they're abstract objects, or they might deny it. What they're committed to is that the domain, the natural reality, is where all the causal stuff happens, right? If they're abstract objects, they're not causal, they're not causally related to us. They've got a different kind of role to play. And so it's pretty standard for naturalists to think, okay, causal reality just is natural reality. And where they differ from everybody else, including the theists, is that other people want to add in more causal stuff to the picture. So for theists, God causes natural reality.
So your view on natural and supernatural distinction is basically the paradigmatic view of the distinction, right? You look at paradigmatic examples of natural and supernatural and say that, look, we have an intuitive grasp of this concept, this distinction. We don't have to worry about the making the more fine-grained version of this distinction. Is that right?
So I think that we understand it well enough that we can go on and have a discussion. It's like other areas of philosophy. If you turn your attention to trying to define something, you find that you have this very long discussion that doesn't end in satisfaction, but you could go on. So we can talk about knowledge. even though the attempt to give a precise definition of knowledge is one that just didn't end up in any kind of agreement at all, right? And it seems to me that just as we think, well, you know, our grasp of knowledge is good enough that we can go on and we can do epistemology and we can have a discussion about various kinds of things, I think our grasp of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural is good enough so that we can go on and have a discussion. In a way, it really wouldn't matter for my purposes if it turned out that somehow or other my account of the natural was defective and you couldn't make sense of the idea of the natural. I would just say, I'm going to tell you what my worldview is. I'm going to compare it with the theist worldview, and I'm going to explain why I think mine is better, and where the label natural goes, I don't really care, right? If somehow or other people persuaded me that you had to be a nominalist, and for whatever reasons it turned out I wasn't one, so I thought there were some abstract objects, that wouldn't bother me. I could just go ahead and make my case the same. So I'm not fussed. I add one other thing here, that to some extent it may well be that my definition is kind of stipulative, right? When I try to say more precise things about naturalism, I am just saying, for the purposes of this discussion, this is how you should understand me when I'm talking about naturalism. But it may very well be that, you know, you go somewhere else and you talk to somebody else and they're going to use the word a bit differently. And one last thing, I use the word differently in different books. So I have a new book coming out, a debate book with Kenny Pierce, and in that I give a definition of naturalism, or an account of naturalism, that's got a couple more bits in it than the definitions in The Best Argument and Naturalism and Religion. So I add in a requirement that minds are late and local. You don't find minds in reality except organisms at the end of kind of long periods of evolution, or things that they make, like AIs, if there is any such things. Right. And I'm happy to build that into the sort of at the foundations of naturalism for that book, for that purpose.
That precludes panpsychism and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we don't. But you can think of that as stipulative, right? So maybe some people. It depends a bit on whether you want to be counted as a naturalist or not. If you're a panpsychist or a panentheist, whether you're going to say, okay, my position's naturalist, right? For the purposes of the Naturalism and Religion book, it just turned out, given the definition that I'd adopted, that pantheism turned out not to be naturalistic, but I don't really care, right? How that goes. It's just, that was a kind of consequence of the account.
About theism, we have also an intuitive grasp of the distinction or the definition of maybe theism. So how should we start comparing what should we look for in theism and naturalism?
So you want to build up a theory. So the first thing you have to do is to develop in principle a theory of everything, right? Because that's really the kind of starting point. It's going to be very hard to argue about the relative merits of theism and naturalism if all you've got is a kind of rough definition of each. What we want is an elaborated theory. So and what I think will happen is that there'll be lots of stuff in common between the elaborated theories, because I think that if you're developing a theory of everything for a large number of domains, you should coordinate your opinion to what the expert consensus is. So for physics, you're just going to say, well, whatever the physicists agree on is going to be my theory of physics, and for chemistry and for mathematics and so on. So if you're thinking about the comprehensive theories that we're building up here, they're going to be very similar all over the place, but there'll be some important differences between them. And there'll be a bunch of data that theists think is explained by appealing to God that naturalists will think is explained in some other way. And so there'll be some small, or I mean, they might be highly significant, but in the context of how much data there is and what we're trying to explain, there'll be massive agreement between the theories, but there'll be some differences. And what we're trying to work out is where we should fall with respect to those differences, the list of things. And that list, as you know, if you've looked at the best argument, is fairly long. There's a lot of things that theists think naturalists don't have a satisfactory account of, but that theists can give a satisfactory account of by appealing to God. So some theists have thought, they maybe less do now, that why is there something rather than nothing is something that naturalists can't explain, but theists can, because theists say God exists of necessity. So there couldn't have been nothing, right? I mean, just to give you an example of the kind of consideration that might come up. So the first step was just build the theories. Once we've got the best versions of the theories, we're going to compare them. I think what we'll take to be the relevant data is just everything that they agree on. And then the way that we'll do the comparison is we'll check, first of all, to see if the theories are consistent as far as we can. I mean, if the theories are complicated enough, and these theories are, I'm assuming they contain arithmetic, we aren't going to be able to prove their consistency. That will be too much, but we can check for consistency. And then the kind of important point is to see which one, assuming they're both consistent, which one's the better theory, which one does a better job of being theoretically virtuous. What is it for a theory to be good? Here I'm going to say there are kind of two main considerations: minimizing your commitments of various kinds, maximizing explanation. There's a trade-off between these two. The more you postulate, the more you can explain. But other things being equal, you don't want to postulate unnecessary things. You only want to postulate as much, just as enough to explain everything. So there's going to be a kind of sweet spot between minimizing your commitments and maximizing explanation. And the question will be, which one of the theories, if either of them, does better at hitting the sweet spot? So that's roughly the idea of the method.
So about the way you compare these theories, theism and naturalism, shall we start looking into more specific examples of data, or?
I don't mind. And I should say one thing: the account of theoretical virtues might look like it's a very small account. It's sort of got minimize commitments and maximize explanation. And there's other things, if you're familiar with discussions about scientific theories, you might think that there are things that are missing from that, like fit with established knowledge. Well, that's not there because these are theories of everything. Or predictive fertility, but that's not there because these are supposed to be theories of everything, right? So there are some familiar theoretical virtues that are not going to, that aren't going to play any role in this debate the way that I'm imagining it. It is a very idealized way of thinking about things, right? And there can be some questions about that we might come back to as well. But we can go on now to kind of talk about some examples, if you like.
Okay. So the first data point you raise is about the causal shape of reality. You basically sketch several ways the causal shape of reality can be, which was regress, necessary initial state, and contingent initial state. I think also there's a sort of circular view as well in one of your papers, but you don't discuss it in later works, I guess.
And the contingent initial state divides into two different kinds. There's one where everything's contingent, and there's one where there's something in there that's necessary. Because it's important to say it's
but contingent state.
It's important to say that because many theists land on that one.
Yeah.
Right. So the circle I decided to just rule out and not
Yeah.
discuss. But I mean, it's a view that you might have, but I think that it leads to problematic consequences, and I'm happy not to take it seriously. I think the other views are all serious views, right? So the regress, necessary initial state, and contingent initial state with or without something necessary. And there are people who have arguments that they think are strong enough to rule out some of those other contenders. And I'm kind of skeptical about that. I'm skeptical that there are strong enough arguments to rule them out. And in some ways, for my purposes, I don't really need to take a stand about that, because we can consider both naturalism and theism in these different versions. Like, we can imagine a theistic story where there's an infinite regress. We can imagine one where the initial state is necessary and so on. And we can compare that with the naturalistic regress or naturalistic necessary state or whatever. And an argument, so this is how I got into this in the first place. I had an argument that it didn't matter how you do that, naturalism will do better on this particular point, no matter what particular shape of causal reality you assume. In some of my later work, I've said that I like the necessary initial state, and that I try to develop up a theory that includes it. But that's not because I believe it, right? I'm still kind of agnostic. It's just that it's much better to have a theory to talk about in particular, right? So I've spent a bit of time trying to work out what that view would look like, and less time worrying about what other versions of naturalism might look like.
So what I really liked about that view was that it basically undercuts, as you say, many versions of cosmological arguments, I think. And also, I think the debate is really framed in a way that puts naturalists in a worse shape, usually, because when theists appeal to necessity of God, for example, to explain reality, they basically say that we left nothing unexplained. But if naturalists don't appeal to any kind of necessity at the beginning or at somewhere in the universe, they basically say that we don't have any explanation for that. So theists usually push that point, and you don't explain the relevant data, and it makes it easier to accuse naturalists of not giving answers to some significant big question. But when you basically say that there's a necessary initial state or necessary initial contingent initial state with something necessary, it basically undercuts that kind of dialectic, and you can just focus on the relevant theoretical virtue.
Right. So I think that's right. I mean, that was exactly what I was thinking when I developed this argument. What I had in mind was that if you played fair and you compared the kind of best version of naturalism with the best version of theism, and you thought, well, maybe it's a regress, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that, and you compared the versions, they would just come out equal in their ability to explain the data. So if the initial state of the universe is itself necessary, then there's no more explanatory work to do. Just as if God's necessary, there's no more explanatory work to do, or the initial state of God is necessary, there's no more explanatory work to do.
So for many people, there's a tendency to see God as necessary, but there's not that much bigger of a tendency to see a natural initial state as necessary. And I think there's some intuitive background to this, in a way that, for example, Josh Rasmussen developed it. God seems like a less arbitrary kind of necessary posit, but a necessary initial state with, or contingent initial state with something necessary, seems to have some arbitrary components like physical parameters which might have different values. So in that case, someone might push you that theism basically has the least arbitrary version of this contingent initial state with necessary existent picture. Right?
So I mean, the way that I understand that is it might be that the initial state is more complicated on the naturalist view than on the theist view. And so it would still be preferable, right? It's not that there'd be a difference in the ability to explain why there's something rather than nothing. It's just that there'd be more resources that had been used on the naturalist side because I mean, the way that Josh wants to say it, Josh Rasmussen wants to say it, God's the kind of simplest possible starting point. And the naturalist starting point is going to be more complicated. And that's why you should prefer the theistic story. Now, I think there's various problems with that. One of them is that we just have no idea what the initial state of the universe looked like at this stage. And so we're kind of whistling in the dark, right? At this stage, we don't have any reason for thinking that it's particularly complicated. We just have no idea. Now that point cuts both ways though, because it leaves it sort of up in the air that maybe at some point in the future we might find out that right. Well, yes, but as things stand, I don't think we've got any reason to assume one way or the other. If we're thinking about everything that's packed into the initial state, I'm suspecting that the theistic hypothesis can't be simpler than the naturalistic hypothesis for the following reason, that if you think of there being different parts of the initial natural state, the theist is going to have to suppose that why each of those parts is the way it is because God wanted it to be that way. And now there's a question about God's wanting it to be that way, whether that's necessary or contingent. It better not all turn out to be necessary, because if it does, it looks like there's only one universe that God can make. So it better all be contingent. But if it's all contingent, then you've got a whole lot of complexity there that just lines up with the complexity on the other side. So it's not at all obvious, right, that whatever the natural state turns out to be, that the theist can get away with claiming that postulating God is going to be simpler, that it's going to have less complexity. And there's I kind of just gave you an argument why you probably should think that that's not going to turn out that way.
So that brings us, I think, to fine-tuning in a way. So in your work, I think one of the most interesting things I found was that you think libertarian free will makes no difference whatsoever when we compare theism and naturalism in the case of fine-tuning, because basically they both postulate some good contingency, both libertarian free will and naturalistic views. So one might push you about that point that the free choices at least make it more probable that certain kinds of outcomes are going to be right, because God wants several kinds of universes, but not so much several other kinds of universes. So that might mean that fine-tuned universes are much more probable in the case where there is a God than there is no God, right? At least we have some reason to expect bias towards fine-tuned universes in the case of theism, but not in the case of naturalism.
Yeah, so maybe. The one question is going to be what's possible here. So, I mean, I'm going to start there before we move to probabilities. So, are we supposing that there's a limitation on the range of universes that God can make? Are there lots of universes that, as far as we can tell, would be possible, but for the fact that God doesn't, there's some reason why God refuses to make, it's impossible for God to make them, something like that. Or is it that we should think about the possibilities for the universe to be the same, whether we're a naturalist or a theist? So that's one kind of question. And I mean, we can have different versions now of naturalism and theism according to the different ranges of possibilities. Okay, so that's one thing. Next thing is, supposing that that we've kind of settled on what the range of possibilities are, is there some way of making sense of the idea that it's more likely that you're going to get some of these possibilities than others, given that they're initial, we might think of them as initial possibilities. So on the one side, we're just thinking there's a whole lot of universes. On the other side, we're thinking there's God, but God's equipped with some dispositions to create. Is there something that makes certain kinds of dispositions to create more likely than others? And if so, what is it? How does that work when we're thinking across the different possible worlds? So we're accepting that God could have made this universe that just lasted for a tiny fraction of a second, but that's a possibility. What makes that more remote as a possibility than the God making the world where there's the fine-tuned constants? So I would like to hear more about that story. Maybe the naturalist, this is less clear. I'm not sure that the naturalist can think that there's some similar kind of probability influencing thing that affects which universe you get if you're a naturalist. Maybe you can't do that. I'm inclined to think that you can't, because I'm inclined to think that that would require a sort of prior state where there was some sort of chance distribution. But I do think that there's something like that. There's going to be something like that in the case of God as well. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, in that case, do you think that chance distributions require some kind of natural law in the case of naturalism?
So I think that if we're thinking about natural reality as a succession of states, in the initial state, there can be a kind of chance distribution for what comes next, what the succeeding states are. But there isn't a domain where there can be a chance distribution that's prior to the initial state, because the initial state's first. So that's why I don't think that there can be anything chancy or libertarian or anything about the initial state. In the case of theism, it now depends how we're thinking about what comes before. Right? Is there a kind of absolutely an initial state of God? Right? And if there is, and if it's contingent, then is there anything that can determine what you get out of the various contingencies? And it seems to me that that the answer is going to be the same in both cases. There can't be anything that determines it. Right? So it feels to me like the kind of putting in the libertarian thing isn't going to help you, because it's not acting at the right place. Both the naturalist and the theist can think that the values of the constants are not fixed in the initial state. They come later because there's some, the chances converge on them. But then it's just massively unlikely in both cases, right? I mean, I assume you have the same probabilities if it's chancy. In the initial state, I don't see how appealing to libertarian freedom is going to get in, because libertarian freedom only applies when you move to another state, and the idea is that the movement is not deterministic. there's a bunch of outcomes that you could get. So I'm not convinced, right, that there is actually any genuine difference that's going to emerge here.
About that, there's also a complication about God's reasons to create a particular possible world. So if God's reasons are determinative of which possible worlds he is going to create, then they are going to turn out necessary. But if God necessarily has these reasons. So, but in the case that they are not strong enough, what explains God's, for example, ability to create no universe whatsoever? Because as far as I understand, God cannot have that kind of a reason to not create anything at all, because he is all good. So I cannot see a coherent picture of God creating nothing other than himself in such cases. Unless you say some sort of a libertarian free choice is a primitive of the theory, which rests on no conception of reasoning whatsoever.
So on the point about reasons, some people, so I think that Josh Rasmussen and Kenny Pierce, the person that I have the recent debate with, both take seriously the idea that maybe God's creation is chancy, right? So, so it is indeterministic which world you get. That doesn't mean that God isn't creating for reasons, and in that case, it doesn't mean that the reasons can't be necessary, right? It's just that because God says, "Yeah, I'm going to create, but what comes out, I'm going to leave that to chance." Mm-hmm. So that's a view that you could have.
One of the things that I really don't see why many theists accept is that it is necessary for God to create something.
Okay, yeah. So yes, you were talking about that. So there are theists who think that that's not true. One brand of theist who doesn't think that's true are the Molinists, who think that the kind of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, sort of God's knowledge about what free creatures would freely do if they were placed in any possible circumstances, just turn out to be so horrible, right, that there's no world that it's open to God to make that isn't just, something that a good being couldn't make. And then God wouldn't create anything. Now that story relies on some controversial assumptions. It relies on there being these truths about what free creatures would do before God makes anything at all. Right? But if you're prepared to buy that, then you can tell a story about why God might not create anything, because he consults these counterfactuals and realizes that there's no world that he can make where people are going to behave decently enough to make it worth creating it. Maybe there are other ways too, but that's one way that you could go.
So we talked about fine-tuning, cosmological arguments, and I also want to talk about arguments from consciousness. Mm-hmm. Basically, I'm very surprised that there's not much work about this topic in the literature. There are very few articles. So you had a debate with, written debate with J.P. Morgan, I think. And I think we are also going to have him on the channel at the future, but I'm not sure when. So can you summarize some of the points you made in that written debate?
Okay, so it's going to be a challenge to remember the particular details of the debate with Morland, but so the kind of view I favour is one on which to have, for one of us, a human being, to have certain kinds of experiences, just is for there to be certain kinds of neural processing going on. I mean, it has to be embedded in the kind of right sort of environment, and we're assuming the right kind of evolutionary history. But given all of that, that's all there is to your experiencing things, is there being certain kinds of neural processing going on. So that kind of view is usually called identity theory. So it's just identifying mental states and neural states. Moreland, I think, doesn't have any good objections to that position. I think from memory, he just kind of dismisses it out of hand as something that couldn't be right. And there are various thought experiments that are supposed to show that it couldn't possibly be right. But I'm just not persuaded that those thought experiments show what they claim to show.
Which is very interesting, because identity theory is a minority position even in philosophy of mind right now.
Oh, absolutely.
So you reject functionalism and...
No, I think that functionalism and the identity theory are consistent. So there's an old dispute that goes back to the 1960s between the Australians and the Americans. So Putnam famously argued that the identity theory and functionalism are inconsistent, whereas Jack Smart and David Armstrong argued that they're perfectly consistent, and indeed that they'd been taking functionalism for granted when they were putting out the identity theory. So I guess in this international dispute, I side with my own country.
Okay, so Moreland is a substance realist, I think. And did you have any objections to substance realism in the exchange, or specifically? Or
so from memory, I wasn't trying to argue for a positive position on the debate in the philosophy of mind. He argued that there's a good argument from consciousness to God, right? And he had an argument with a bunch of premises, and I thought that there were various things wrong with his argument. I think that if you're an identity theorist, you're in a better position than the dualist, because you've got a simpler theory and it explains all the data just as well. I'm going to use the same methodology everywhere. So in assessing that debate, the question is just going to be whether the identity theorist can adequately explain all of the data. And I find it quite hard to see what kind of data there could be that the identity theorist wouldn't be able to explain. So in that sense, I could have offered a kind of argument in the philosophy of mind against the position that Moreland favours, but that wasn't really the point. The point of our discussion was just that he thought that he could prove that atheism was mistaken on the grounds of, he could prove that God exists on the basis of some considerations about consciousness. And I think that's not very likely. And you don't have to assume the identity theory, right? You could be not an identity theorist, but you could be some other kind of functionalist, somebody who has a kind of something that other people think of as not, as something that's inconsistent with the identity theory, like a role realizer account of some kind. And you could still object to Moreland's arguments.
One might push you that theism has an ontology that is better equipped to deal with consciousness, because consciousness is fundamental, so to speak, in the universe, and this alone makes it more to be expected that there are conscious creatures, unlike naturalism.
Right, and so I deny that consciousness is fundamental. There wasn't any consciousness until there were organisms, and that happens quite late in the... if you think about that, if we can talk this way about the evolution of the universe, it's not until there were third generation stars that we had the kinds of conditions that you need to get planets on which organisms can flourish. So we're halfway through the history of the universe to now, before there's even the possibility of consciousness appearing. And as far as we know, consciousness is pretty rare. We haven't yet detected it anywhere except on Earth. So I would just dispute the idea that it's fundamental. Now, you might think that it was somehow fundamental in another way, but it's hard to understand how if it's fundamental, it can be absent for such a long period of time.
My point was about whether theism or naturalism makes consciousness more to be expected.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions there will be why you would think that theism is going to make it expected. Right now, this comes down in part to your views about the nature of God. So if, like Moreland, you think that God is conscious and you think that, that people are made in God's image, then you'll have a kind of straightforward explanation of why we're conscious, right? That a kind of theistic explanation. But if, for example, you go with a more Thomistic account and you don't think that God's a person at all, then it's not so clear why you would be expecting that, because consciousness isn't there in the foundations, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe they also have their own version of hard problem of consciousness. Yeah. About that point, you have you discussed about hylomorphic dualism with in any of the live streams?
So I haven't discussed hylomorphism. I haven't really talked about philosophy of mind much at all. I mean, I would certainly not claim to have much expertise in philosophy of mind. I was hired to teach it at Monash, and so I taught it for a few years, and so I know a bit about the literature. But there's a lot of stuff. Like there's lots of recent work that's been done on what's called the neural correlates of consciousness. So consciousness studies is a big thing in neuroscience these days, and I'm really not up on what's happening in that field.
I see. So you discuss rarely moral arguments, I think, because in your later work you are specifically interested in causal features of reality and general causal patterns maybe in reality. But most theists will say that there's also moral arguments and arguments about other features of reality that are maybe not about causal features. So in that case, maybe we can discuss this moral arguments, maybe for lemma and so on. And later, maybe we can talk about whether this makes any difference. Non-causal features make any difference regarding your case for naturalism.
So in the best argument against God, there's a long section about morality and what naturalists can. I mean, naturalists, in a naturalistic worldview, you've got to have stuff to say about conscience, morality, and how if you think we have not moral knowledge, how we get it, and if what account you're going to give of goodness and obligation and things like that, right? So that the distinction between that the way that we characterize naturalism was in terms of the kind of causal order, in no way sort of hives off all of that stuff from discussion. So the question there's a bunch of questions, right? I mean, it depends which ones you want to talk about. If the question is about sort of objectivity, are there moral truths? I'm quite happy to say yes. I can give you examples. I think that it's just wrong to torture infants for fun, for example. I don't think that, I just think that that's true. And I don't think that it's a fundamental moral truth. I think there are more fundamental truths that one can be derived from. But I think that the fundamental moral truths are necessary. And there's nothing more to say, because once you hit necessity, there's no explaining. Now, can the theists take a different line is the question here. Can they give a kind of more economical account of morality? Well, not if they're going to accept that moral truths are necessary, right? According to me, because you can't explain. There's no explaining things that are necessary. And so you kind of end up on that side of the Euthyphro dilemma where you end up saying it's just contingent. God could have made it the case that it was perfectly fine to boil babies in oil, for example, right? And I just think that's a horrible view, right? And you don't want to go there.
About moral knowledge, do you think it creates any more serious problems for naturalism?
So the knowledge of what's necessary is tricky, but I don't think that moral knowledge is more tricky than mathematical knowledge. And so it's unsurprising that there's also an argument about mathematics, right? About the ontology of mathematics, and then there's this epistemological worry. But I'm not really very moved by either of these. And I think it's quite easy when you look back through the history of mathematics to understand how, with the capacities we've got, we are able to discover various necessary truths, right? But I think that something similar is the case about morality. If you think about, for example, some of the claims that we make about fairness, it's not hard to work out that if we're equals and we've got a cake, the only fair distribution is going to be to cut it in half, right? And that if we want a procedure, one of us will cut it and the other one will choose, right? And we can think of those things as just, you know, it's that shows how we get a grasp of certain fundamental necessary truths about morality. So I don't think that there's lots of details to discuss here, but I don't think that there's anything in the kind of data about morality that's going to be a serious problem for the naturalist as opposed to the theist.
Maybe we can talk about there's an evolutionary motivation for that kind of epistemological worry in the case of theists. So theists usually think that since being able to reliably track moral truths does not have survival value or does not increase your reproductive success, on naturalism, don't expect that to be tracked reliably.
Right. So I think that argument just completely ignores the role that the social plays in human evolution. There's a reason why groups that are key to fairness are much more likely to succeed than ones that aren't, right? So it's no surprise, right, that we would have evolved latching onto the necessary truths, evolved in this social, but putting together the biological and the social together. It's no surprise that we ended up with very strong kind of innate dispositions about fairness, which you can see, right? There's really interesting psychological research on newborns. They have strong views about what's fair and what isn't.
Yeah.
But that will be a kind of interesting interplay between. It's not like we grew up as isolated individuals and magically acquired moral knowledge before we became social creatures, right? That's just the wrong view. And we've been social creatures for millions and millions of years. And there's a complex interplay between the biological and the social in a more extended sense, our evolutionary history. So I don't think that there's anything problematic there for naturalists either.
Do you think that our moral faculties are reliable in this case? Or do you think that they are unreliable, but we have procedures to make them approximate?
So I would think that it's kind of like with mathematics. We have some elementary skills, right? We've got some sort of general capacities, but without socialization, you're going to get nowhere with mathematics. And without socialization, you're not going to get anywhere with morality either, right? There's a whole lot of the cultural that's very important in all of this. And if you don't get nurturing and you don't get education in the early years, there'll be skills that you'll never be able to acquire. And it feels to me like the mathematical and the moral are going to go the same way here. And if you don't get language at the right time, it's very hard to acquire it, for example.
At the age of 6, you can't learn it whatsoever.
So I just see all of this as being of a piece, right? And it's all explained in the same kind of way.
So about, since we talked about evolution and morality, maybe we can also discuss a little bit about the evolutionary argument against naturalism, which you discussed in your book, Naturalism and Religion. So can you briefly explain what the argument is? It has, I believe, several different versions.
Okay, this is going to be hard. So the argument's due to Plantinga. And the version that I discuss in the book is the one from his book called Where the Conflict Really Lies. And he said at the time that he hoped that this would be the final the final version of the argument. And I don't think he gave a version of it afterwards. So I think it is the final version. What he argues is that the probability that our faculties are reliable, either our faculties generally, or at least our kind of metaphysical faculty, the faculties that we use when we're doing metaphysics, are unreliable on the assumption that naturalism and evolutionary theory are both true. And he thinks that it's an untenable position to suppose that your cognitive faculties or your metaphysical faculties are unreliable. And so any view that holds to the combination of evolutionary theory and naturalism is untenable. That's roughly the argument that he's got. So, and he has an argument, right? Kind of what's driving the argument is the claim that the probability of our faculties being reliable on naturalism and evolutionary theory is very low. Now, in response to this, I say, well, look, the probability that our faculties are reliable when it comes to metaphysics is close to zero. Just look around at all the disagreement that there is about metaphysics in the world. There's no way, any theory that says that our faculties for metaphysics are reliable is just wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So Plantinga better think that the probability of reliability given theism is low, right? But then he's in the same
position. Otherwise, it would be theism. Right?
Yeah. So otherwise, he's in the same position as the naturalist, and so this can't be a good objection. So that was for the metaphysics. Now the question's a bit different in general because on any view, it seems like our faculties are reliable in lots of ways and unreliable in other ways. And there's this tricky question about, so what's, when you put it all together, are we reliable or not? Now, I think that that kind of evolutionary theory and naturalism is pretty good at predicting where we're going to be reliable and where we won't. So when it comes to identifying moving things in our immediate environment, we're very good at that. And there's a reason, a good evolutionary reason why. If it's a foggy day and the things are far away, we're not so good at it. But, you know, the costs that would have been involved in trying to, you know, it just wasn't going to happen. There's kind of evolutionary reason why we're going to be bad there. And if you sort of extend this across the board, you're going to think, you know, there are various deficits we have. We're kind of bad at certain kinds of probabilistic reasoning, quite simple probabilistic reasoning, for example. If we've just got this, you know, general purpose processor and we use quick and dirty heuristics to work out various kinds of things, it's understandable why we make errors. But God wasn't constrained in the ways that evolutionary theory was. So why is it on the theistic theory that we turn out to be bad in exactly the ways that we do? It's not clear that it isn't the naturalists who've got a better explanation of the particular deficits that our reasoning is subject to, as well as the things that we're good at. And so, if anything, there's a kind of worry that the boot's on the other foot and that it's Plantinga who's in the worst position when it comes to the data. Right. So that's the overall drift of that chapter and what I think about.
I think that's right, Prof. And I think that's also very similar with what Paul Brecker says about fallacy of understated evidence. And I really like to give that answer to evolutionary argument against naturalism, that look, the distribution of reliable and unreliable faculties are more to be expected on natural or better fits with naturalism. But I think Plantinga's central worry was about mental causation, basically, right? Because he doesn't see a way that beliefs and their contents cause what you do under a naturalistic view. So in that case, the main problem for naturalists seems to be explaining how mental content causes physical change in reality for Plantinga. If there's no reason to expect that kind of mental causation in naturalism, then it might be said that we need to expect unreliability all over the place under naturalism, on naturalism. But the problem is, I don't think a naturalist should have a precise theory of mental causation to be able to say that, look, there's mental causation. We can just say that there's mental causation. We don't know exactly how, but it seems natural. We have reasons to think that mind is natural. So that's the end of the story. We might say that without giving any detailed account of mental causation.
So that sounds reasonable to me. And in the book, I have a long discussion about a range of more simple creatures than us and what we should think about the attribution of mental states to them. Plantinga doesn't want to attribute mental states to frogs, for example. He thinks of them as just little mechanical devices with inputs and outputs. But that doesn't do justice to the frogs. The frogs are capable of several different behaviors at any given time. And what they do depends not only on the inputs, but their internal processing as well. And so while we can't be too precise about what their contents are, we can say something about, you know, what the content. So why does the frog flick out its tongue when there's this small dark thing flying past? Well, its representation is that that's food, right? And so if it's not busy doing something else, like fleeing from a bird or something, when one of those things goes past, it'll probably flick its tongue out, but not if it's full, not as I said, if it's, you know, if it's eaten a lot recently, it won't, and so on, right? There's processing, there's a complicated array of neurons, even in the frog's brain. And it makes sense that what it's doing depends upon how it's representing its environment to be. And sometimes, and it's going to be accurate in certain ways, in certain respects. I mean, we shouldn't think that it has beliefs in the same sense that we do. It can't verbalize them, for example, but it's got something that's a lot like beliefs, right? And it's going to be accurate, right? And the reason why it's going to be accurate has to do with its survival. If the frog's no good at working out what's food, it's not going to last long and it's not going to reproduce and so on. So I actually think that it's very straightforward to respond to that kind of argument.
I also see it very strange that planting things beliefs are somehow not constituted by which dispositions they produce, right? Because the belief about there's a tiger over there might produce with some complexity that you should run away from it. But he thinks that there is no such disposition built into beliefs somehow. Is that right way to understand it?
So he thinks that it could be that you completely misperceive the tiger, and you think that I can't remember how this goes, but he imagines if your other beliefs and desires are also wildly mistaken, you can combine it with the mistaken idea that the tiger is your friend and you don't need to run away to end up with your running away anyway, right? And so we don't have to think that your beliefs are accurate. All that matters is that your beliefs conduce to your survival. But it's actually very hard to tell a plausible story for frogs or tigers or us, on which, you know, we have these representational capacities and they're wildly mistaken, and yet we flourish, right? Yeah. That's just weird. Right? But that's the kind of story that he tells. It's a kind of story that might be that at once upon a time some people might have tried to use just to motivate total skepticism about our capacities, but it's just not plausible.
So about that one, maybe we can say that, for example, planting things, there are some alternative webs of beliefs and desires that are equally conducive to our survival, but that are totally wrong about their picture of the world. But the problem, it seems to me, that that kind of alternative webs of beliefs and desires seems to be much more complex than others, right? Especially the reliable one seems to be a more simpler one, and evolutionarily speaking, we have reasons to expect that simpler belief, desire structure.
So I mean, there are complexities here, and I think that you're probably right that it is going to be more complicated. It's not, but I'm not sure that it's completely obvious, but it's more that the sort of connecting everything up, the perception and the behavior and so on, isn't going to produce survival unless there's accurate representation. That's I think the more important worry, right? And the idea that you could tell some other story, it's still going to be a massively implausible story, I think. Yeah. The straightforward story that attributes content is going to be one that matches with the capacities of the creatures to see things and hear things and identify food and all that kind of stuff.
Lastly, we talk about any arguments for the existence of God. So we might now start to compare briefly the naturalism, and then maybe end the discussion.
So you now want to think about how the details of the comparison between the overall comparison between naturalism and theism goes on all of the evidence. Is that the?
Yeah.
So the way I see it, naturalism is simpler, right? So all that remains is the question about how naturalism and theism stack up on all the evidence. What I've been arguing case by case is that naturalism's doing as well as theism. Maybe in some cases it does better, but I don't, for the purposes of the argument I'm about to run, I don't care about that. So we haven't talked about evil, for example. Maybe naturalism does better there, but I don't care. It doesn't do worse, right? So long as it doesn't do worse on anything, and it maybe does better on some things, that will be enough to establish that naturalism's a better theory, because it wins on simplicity and it doesn't lose on explanation. And so given that they're the only things that we're taking into account, it's obviously the better theory, right? So that's how we get to the conclusion. That depends on it's being true that in every case, naturalism does at least as well as theism. And that's quite controversial, and there are a lot of cases, and we haven't talked about all of them. And so you might well be skeptical about the claim that this is a successful argument, and so am I, right? At the end of the book, I say, you know, there's various ways that this argument could go wrong, and certainly I haven't considered all of the bits of data that you might consider. And I'm quite happy to think that there's a kind of aspect of judgment here. So if you're a theist looking at this, you just think, well, there's enough points where theism is better, that it overcomes the advantage that naturalism has with respect to simplicity. And I think, I don't mind if that's how you see it. Right, what I was doing was just explaining how I see it, and why I think that I've got good reason to be a naturalist. And I think that this kind of accurately reflects my reasons. But if I was persuaded that some of the cases went the other way, that wouldn't make any difference to the overall conclusion, right? I would probably have to go back and say, well, look, you know, there are these various points where actually I think theism isn't doing as well as naturalism. It's just that for the argument that I was running in that book, I didn't need to insist on that.
So is there a specific reason why you don't prefer a cumulative case version of an argument for naturalism, like summing the probabilities and getting the point that theism is less probable than naturalism, than naturalism?
So I'm skeptical about the approach that Swinburne takes, the Bayesian approach, where he thinks you can give numbers to the prior probabilities and you can give numbers to the conditional probabilities, the likelihoods. So, you know, the conditional probabilities of the evidence given the theories. I don't think that you can do that. It's not that I'm not a Bayesian in other contexts. I just think that in this context, if you're going to, any numbers that you assign, you're just going to be making them up. And what you say at the end is completely sensitive to what you say at the beginning. It's not like other cases where we think Bayesian reasoning is fine, where we think that as we gradually accumulate more and more evidence, it doesn't matter within a range where we start, we're going to converge to the truth. But here, there's a sort of set amount of evidence. We take it all into account, and then there isn't more evidence to come in, and yet what we say will be completely sensitive to what we thought the prior probabilities were and what we thought the likelihoods were. So they're the reasons why I don't go that way. Why I don't say, okay, we can actually plonk some numbers in here and out will come the answer that naturalism is way more probable than theism on the total evidence.
Maybe not with numbers. I think maybe you can have the general approach of cumulative case arguments without assigning determinate probabilities to evidence and conditional probabilities.
You need ratios, I mean, to get rid of the numbers, but you still, in a way, you can just put this now in a Bayesian framework. I think the prior probability of naturalism is slightly higher than the prior probability of theism. And for each of the likelihoods, I think that the likelihood of the evidence on naturalism is no lower than the likelihood for, and then it just falls out that we should prefer naturalism to theism. But putting it in that kind of Bayesian odds form didn't add anything that wasn't already there with the other description, right? That's just another way of saying the same thing.
Maybe you can say that your view of your way of comparing theism and naturalism is, as you said, a very idealized version of making the comparison. Like, right, you are not discussing the details of, usually at least in the best argument book, details of morality, for example, or details of consciousness, and how one might think that theism, on theism and consciousness is more probable, and so on. You are not making a comparison with taking into account the details of what theism or atheism or naturalism is better equipped to explain.
No, I all I do is sketches, because I wanted to sketch the form of the argument in a kind of brief way. And I think on the question about why is there something rather than nothing, I've given a fairly detailed account elsewhere of why naturalism is no worse than theism in the answers that it can give to that question. And some of the others I've done that as well. But I'm happy to allow, right? This was I wasn't defending the argument, and B, it was only a sketch, right? It's an incomplete sketch. But if you really want to, well, I actually don't think you can complete the argument either. That is, you can't exhaust the discussion. Yeah. But if you thought you could, you just write a very long book, right? Which you go through. But discussing, and I draw attention to about 6 different dimensions of the discussion of morality. The only ones I can remember at the moment are kind of moral knowledge, moral ontology, and conscience, but there's some other things in there as well. Discussing all of that stuff would be a huge book all on its own.
Even
and so people do just make judgments here, right? So you know, you already have your kind of beliefs and about the different, maybe about as detailed as about the different bits of morality, and you might think that the atheist story about conscience is just not as good as the theistic story about conscience. We could go and we could talk about that, and that would be a big discussion all on its own.
Okay, so since naturalism is simpler, in summary, it is to be preferred, at least on the abstract level, to theism. So I think that is all what we are going to discuss about that specific debate. So right now I want to ask you some more of a general questions, which I'm going to ask to, I think, pretty much all of our participants in later live streams. So the first one came from a subscriber, which was, which religion would you prefer if you believe in any of them? Do you think some are better than others, or there are some general considerations that cut through all of them?
So, yeah, so if it's just religions, I'd prefer the more benign ones, to the ones that are less benign. So, but I don't think that, I mean, that distinction kind of cross-cuts, sort of, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or whatever. I don't think there's, as far as the major religions go, I don't play favorites. I don't think that, for example, say, all the streams of Buddhism are just inferior to the various streams of Judaism, or even that there's some stream of Buddhism that's just better than all the streams of Judaism. I just don't have beliefs like that. right? So I think that people can be kind of reasonable adherents of a very wide range of religions.
I think that's right. And another question was about on which topics and which positions you change your philosophical career.
So I've changed my mind about lots of things over time. So earlier, I mean, when you start out in philosophy, you're very influenced by your immediate teachers, and you tend to take on things that they believe. You don't realize that they're controversial, right? There are some, like they tell you some things that are sort of up for debate, but there are other things that they just assume when they're arguing, right? And you don't realize that they're controversial until later. And so there are people whose views I was much closer to in the past than I am now. And David Lewis would be a good example. He was one of my advisors, so he played a very important role in my early development. I find over time that I disagree with him about more and more things, right? That's not surprising. One thing that one aspect of that is that when I started out, I was just kind of brought up with the view that conceivability is a pretty good guide to possibility. So you can work out what's possible by just sitting there and thinking about the scenario and seeing if you can see any difficulties with it. And if you can't see any impossibilities,
combining particularities,
then it's possible.
Properties.
Now, right, and that was supposed to be kind of metaphysical possibility that we were talking about, right? So that the kind of human mind was somehow equipped in this magical way to do metaphysics. And I've stopped believing that. I mean, that what that view gives you is a vast range of possibilities. And there's all kinds of stuff in there. People starting out in philosophy often find that view weird, right? And I'm much more sympathetic to their finding it weird than I used to be. And so now I think of the metaphysical possibilities as really just constrained by the chances, right? You know, what could have been is just what the chances would have permitted. And that you can imagine stuff is no guide at all to what's metaphysically possible. Right? So that's a very big change that's happened, right? So I now have this view that the possible worlds sort of form a structure. Every possible world shares some initial history with the actual world and branches off when the chances play out differently. That gives you a very small bunch of possibilities, but I don't think that you need more than that. It's true that that when we talk about probability, we often talk about the possibilities, the possibility space over which you get the probabilities. And there'll be things like, suppose that tossing a coin is deterministic, then the possibilities there are not metaphysical. They're kind of doxastic. It has to do with your ignorance, or in some cases, sort of errors that you've made, that you're making these probability judgments. But you don't need metaphysics for those kinds of probabilities, according to, for those kinds of possibilities, according to me. Those are not metaphysical possibilities. They're merely doxastic or something like that. So, if it's a fair coin, the probability is going to be 50-50, and that will guide things like your betting behavior, even if when the coin's in the air, it's determined whether it's going to come down heads or tails. And that if that was a fact, that would just be metaphysical. There'd be no metaphysical possibilities now if it was determined that it was going to come down tails. Anyway, so that's one way. That's one way in which my views have changed a lot. And there are plenty.
By the way, your view has one more convert. I think you said only two other people thought the same way, John Hyland, Ned Hall. The other one is me. I really liked the view, not just because of my way of approaching that issue was taking a dispositional Aristotelian account of probability, and that immediately appeared to me that for any possibility to be, there must be something that has the disposition to make that possibility real. I think the underlying intuition of mine was that, and I think, in fact, we can formulate a version of cosmological arguments for just barely a necessary being on the ground of that kind of Aristotelian view of modality.
Right, and you get it on my view, right? So if there's an initial state, it's got to be necessary, right? Because all worlds share it. And that's just what it is to be. Oh, sorry, that's not what it is to be necessary, but the possible, you know, and the intuition. If you've got this intuition that possibilities are grounded in actual powers, so long as you've got a finite history, you're going to get back to something that's necessary. Yeah,
I think that's right.
So I think that's right too.
Okay. Another thing I think you changed your mind about was moral realism. You seem like much more sympathetic to it right now than your paper is got good by definition.
Yeah, that's true. It's one of those things where I go backwards and forwards because I'm not a moral philosopher, right? I'm not actively engaged in the contemporary debates, but so maybe you want to draw a distinction between different kinds or grades of moral realism. I think there are moral truths, and I think that some of those moral truths are necessary. There are other people who think the same thing, but aren't happy with the idea that moral truths don't need an ontology, and so they'll have something to that necessary truths don't need ontology, and so they'll add more stuff to it. And then there are other people who are naturalists.
Does that connect to your work on truth minimalism?
So the work on minimalism about truth, that paper that I wrote with John Hawthorne, is much more just a classificatory piece. It wasn't committed to taking a stand about whether minimalism was correct or not. And the other paper that's relevant there, the Minimalism and Truth Aptness paper that I wrote with Frank Jackson and Michael Smith, had a couple of examples, and one of them is the moral case. But we were talking about the theories there where the kind of you think that the moral claims are not truth apt. I don't think that although I think John Hawthorne might have disagreed about this, I didn't think that I was committing myself to any particular view about minimalism about either of those things in that discussion. Though maybe I was, maybe the truth aptness thing, I was committing myself to something more than minimalism about that when I think about it, but not truth, not about truth. And I'm kind of sympathetic to Quine's view about truth, that there's no ontology that goes along with the commitment to truth. There's no kind of metaphysics of truth.
In the case of moral truths, I believe most metaethicists are unhappy with not requiring an ontology to moral truth for there be moral truth. Is there anyone else in the literature that shares your intuition about that? Like maybe
I'm not
say that. I guess.
So I'm not sure. I would have to go and have a look. There are so many competing positions, because there's the fictionalists, and not that there's a lot of them, but there's some. But there's lots of anti-realists of all different kinds, and lots of naturalists go to one of those other two positions rather than to even the kind of minimal sort of realism that I'm drawn to. So I haven't kept up.
Maybe Richard Timber might be an example to your view, because he thinks that even if there were nothing, there would be moral truth. I guess he is also a human of some sort, so he would be skeptical about abstract objects. So I think he would agree with you about moral truth not requiring an
Yes.
ontology.
So that could be right.
Okay, so that was one question. The other one was that about the way philosophy of religion is done. What would you change in the field if you had a magic wand that you can change everything?
So for a while now, there have been people in Anglo-American philosophy talking about taking other religions more seriously. But the conversation is still completely dominated by topics that come from Christianity. There's a little bit of stuff about Judaism. There's some interesting young Anglo-American Jewish philosophers, also philosophers in that tradition. But beyond that, in philosophy of religion, there's not much else. And that makes philosophy of religion seem really badly named to me.
Philosophy of Christianity or philosophy of general theism might be better.
Yeah. Perhaps the philosophy of Abrahamic theism with a special emphasis on Christianity or something like that would be a way of accurately characterizing the field. And so that would be one thing that I'd want to change. Another thing would be, I think, to see much more attention paid to what the work that's being done in fields outside philosophy on religion, like cognitive anthropology of religion and psychology of religion and things like that. But where I would hope, though I couldn't say for sure, that those fields, I mean, I know that cognitive anthropology of religion does focus on religions generally. So they're kind of, because they're anthropologists, they're interested in religion in general, but I'd hope the other fields would be interested in religion in general as well. So those would be two things that I think would improve philosophy of religion a lot. Maybe a third thing would be if people kind of gave up on the idea that somehow or other we're going to produce arguments that are going to convince people to change their minds. And so that we stopped talking about arguments and we started talking about the kind of contents of beliefs and theories in the way that I like to do. I think that would probably be an improvement too.
Yeah, so you are skeptical in general about the standard approach in philosophy of religion that rests on premise, conclusion, form, argument.
I'm skeptical about the value of talking about arguments, mainly because most conversations about arguments will come down to one side rejects one of the premises and the other side doesn't. Well, there's no point in having that kind of discussion. What we should do is just set the theories out and then note all the points that we disagree about, and then think about what might lead to shifts in opinions, whether there's evidence that might shift somebody on one side. Right? Unless you think that there's inconsistencies out there, like, you know, if someone's got an inconsistent position and they can't see it, a little argument might help them to see it. You know, you can give a derivation and show that there's a formal inconsistency in their views. Well, they should pay attention at that point. They should go away and think about what they want to change. But that is so rare that hardly ever happens.
Right. And I believe the last question is going to be, what are some topics you are recently working on, especially the most recent projects you have?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's a book coming out, a debate book with Kenny Pierce. Sadly, we're kind of at the point where we have to do things like the index and stuff like that. So I'm working on really boring stuff. The most recent paper, so a paper that I'm working on at the moment, is a paper about religious fictionalism. So Richard Joyce and Stuart Brock are running a conference, and I'm way late with my paper for this. What I want to argue is that there's a sense in which community-wide religious fictionalism really doesn't make sense. If you think about what the kind of essential nature of religion is, the idea that there might be community embrace of religious fictionalism seems to me to be just massively implausible. So that's the kind of crude idea. I'm still trying to work out the details.
Thanks a lot for joining us, and I think that's the end.
Okay, thanks for inviting me.
No problem.